Montana Territory. Autumn of 1882, the wind whipped sharp through the basin east of the Crazy Mountains, and Zeke Northwood squinted into the sun as he leaned against the corral post. His ranch hands were short, one man in the bunkhouse and one woman in the kitchen. The first he could fix easy. The second, that was proving harder. He needed someone who could cook 3 meals a day for 6 men, keep a clean kitchen, and not mind the silence of the land. What he did not expect when he answered the letter was for the woman to show up with a baby in her arms. The stagecoach clattered to a stop in a swirl of dust. Zeke stepped forward, brushing road grit off his sleeves. The door opened and a woman climbed down, holding a bundled child close to her chest. Her dress was simple, her boots dusty, but her eyes, those were something else entirely. Pale green, steady, tired but proud. "Mr. Northwood?" she asked. He nodded. "That's me." "I'm Ellery Hayes. You hired a cook," she said, lifting her chin. "I am one, but the letter said nothing about children, and I have one." Zeke looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. "A boy, maybe 2. Round cheeks, dark blonde curls, a little birthmark above his left brow. Zeke's heart thudded. He knew that mark. He had one just like it. The boy stirred, opened his eyes, and Zeke's breath caught. Same eyes. Steel blue. His own stare looking back at him from a face half the size. Ellery shifted, adjusting the boy's weight. "His name is Celas." Zeke cleared his throat. "Come inside, we'll talk." The house was simple wood floors, stone hearth, a table worn smooth in the center of the room. Zeke gestured for her to sit. She did, setting Celas gently on her lap as the boy blinked around sleepily. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one, then sat across from her. "You should know something, that boy." He paused. "He looks like me." Ellery tensed. "I noticed." Zeke rubbed a hand down his face. "Have we met before?" She looked at the boy, then back at him. "Yes, 5 years ago in Abilene." And just like that, the memory snapped into place. A dance hall, a thunderstorm outside. A woman in a blue dress who had laughed at his terrible 2-step. One night, no promises, then gone by morning. His mouth was dry. "You never said I did not know," she said, her voice quiet. "Not then. I found out after, and by then you were gone. I tried to write to the ranch you mentioned. Got no reply. I figured you had moved on, so I did too." Zeke stared at Celas, now tugging at a thread on his mother's sleeve. "That boy is mine." Ellery nodded once. "Yes." Zeke stood, walked to the window, his pulse loud in his ears. "Why come here, Ellery?" "I needed work," she said, honest and calm. "I had nowhere else to go. I figured if you were still here you'd remember me, and if not, I hoped you'd treat us fair." He turned, met her eyes. "You should have told me sooner." "I did not come to ask you for anything," she said, her voice firmer now. "I came to cook, that is all." Zeke crossed the room and crouched in front of Celas. The boy blinked at him, then reached out, fingers brushing Zeke's beard. Ellery's breath hitched. "You will stay," Zeke said. "Both of you." She looked wary. "You do not have to, I want to." She searched his face, then gave a small nod. "All right." The bunkhouse got a new hand that afternoon, and Ellery got the kitchen. She moved into the small room off the back of the house. At dinner, 6 cowboys filled their plates and praised the stew. Silas sat on a pillow beside his mother, spoon in one hand, a biscuit in the other. Zeke watched him, stunned by the details. The way Silas laughed with his whole face, the way he furrowed his brow when confused, just like him. That night, Zeke stood alone under the stars, hands in his pockets. The land stretched quiet around him, the house warm behind him. He had never expected to find a child of his own, and he had never expected to find Ellery Hayes again. But now she was here. And so was Celas. Zeke was not sure what came next, but he knew he would not let either of them go. By the 3rd morning, the kettle whistled before the sun had climbed fully past the eastern ridge. Ellery moved through the kitchen with quiet rhythm, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair pinned back in a twist that had loosened sometime before daylight. Outside, the ranch stirred. Horses called low from the stables, and boots thudded over packed dirt as hands readied for the day. Zeke stepped inside with his gloves tucked under one arm, the scent of fresh bread and something sweet warming the air. He watched her stack tin cups near the stove, the child still asleep in the cot tucked into the pantry corner. "You always start this early?" he asked, keeping his voice low. She glanced back. "If I don't, breakfast starts tasting like regret and burnt beans." A chuckle rumbled in his chest before he could stop it. "That's so? You're welcome to try it yourself if you think I'm exaggerating." He leaned against the doorframe, studying the way she moved, efficient, unhurried, as if she'd been part of this house for longer than 3 days. "I'll stick to fence work, thanks." Her expression softened, but she didn't stop moving. "You and your men like the cornbread, didn't leave a crumb if that answers you." She nodded once, not smiling, but something in her shoulders eased. "Good." Zeke walked to the counter, picked up one of the coffee cups and filled it from the pot. He noticed a small leather pouch resting near the flour bin. "You sewing?" Ellery wiped her hands and reached for it. "Mending trousers." "Yours, I think." They've been sitting with a split seam for a month, figured they were past saving. She opened the pouch and pulled out a needle already threaded with dark blue cotton. "They're not. You just need someone who doesn't mind sitting still long enough." Zeke sipped the coffee. "That ain't often me." She didn't answer right away. Just took the trousers to the table and began stitching along the torn edge, her fingers sure and practiced. A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but full of things unsaid. He watched the light from the window catch on her wrist as she worked. "I've been thinking," he said after a while. "Celas, he'll need a proper bed." Ellery's hand paused. "The cot's fine." "It's not," Zeke said. "I've got that storage room across the hall, it's big enough." "Needs cleaning out, but I can do that." Her eyes lifted. "You don't have to go to trouble, I know." He set his cup down. "But I want to." She looked at him a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "All right." The child stirred then, a soft grunt from the corner. Ellery rose and crossed to him, lifting him gently. Silas's arms wrapped around her neck, face pressed against her shoulder. Zeke stepped forward. "You want me to take him for a bit? While you finish," she hesitated, then handed the boy over without a word. Celas blinked up at him, still half asleep, his small hand curling into the collar of Zeke's shirt. "I'll show him the barn," Zeke said quietly. "Let him meet the colts." Ellery watched the two of them for a breath, then turned back to the mending. Outside, the morning sun lit the dust gold. Zeke carried the child easily, Celas settled against his chest, thumb in his mouth. The ranch sat in its usual hush, the kind that came with wide land and honest work. But something had shifted. The house felt different now, lived in, anchored like it had a purpose beyond keeping out the cold. As he stepped into the barn, the younger horses stirred in their stalls, heads lifting, ears twitching. Zeke moved slow, letting the boy look around. Celas pointed at a roan colt, wide-eyed. "That's Redbud," Zeke said. "A bit wild yet, but smart." Celas leaned forward, and Zeke shifted so the boy could touch the colt's mane. The horse snorted but held still, curious. They stayed like that a while, the child's fingers brushing the horse's neck, Zeke's hand steady at his back. By the time they returned to the house, breakfast plates were stacked neatly on the table and Ellery was sweeping flour from the floor. She looked up as they entered, her gaze finding Celas first, then Zeke. "He liked Redbud," Zeke said. "I'm not surprised," she replied, brushing a curl from her cheek. "He's never been afraid of animals." Zeke crossed to her, shifted the boy into her arms. "He's got a good way about him." Ellery looked down at her son, then back at Zeke. "He gets that from you." He didn't answer. Just stood there, the air between them thick with something neither of them could name yet. But it was there, quiet and steady. Later that day, Zeke cleared out the storage room. He sorted tools, moved crates, swept dust from the floorboards. When he was done, he opened the shutters and let in the sun. The space was small, but it would do. That night, when the fire cracked low in the hearth and the ranch had gone still, Zeke sat alone at the kitchen table, mending another tear in his shirt by lantern light. The house felt warmer. Not because of the fire, because it wasn't just his anymore. The wind came dry from the west that week, carrying the scent of sage and the faint warning of early frost. Zeke spent most daylight hours hauling wood for the main house and patching the east fence where elk had pushed through. He returned late in the afternoon with his shirt damp at the collar and a splinter in his thumb, just as Ellery was wringing out a cloth at the basin. "You favor your left hand," she said without looking up. He raised his brows. "I do, when you're tired. You shift your weight wrong too. Means your right shoulder's bothering you." Zeke leaned against the doorframe and worked the splinter free with the tip of his knife. "You always this sharp-eyed." "Only when I've got reason," she said, folding the cloth and laying it over the edge of the washtub. "You've got a break in the seam of your coat. I can fix it tonight. I can mend my own coat." "You can," she allowed, "but you won't." Zeke let the corner of his mouth twitch. "You always this bossy." "Only when someone's too stubborn to admit he's worn through half his clothes." He stepped inside and set the knife on the table. "You ever think about staying on past winter?" Ellery dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him. "You offering, I'm asking." She studied him, green eyes steady. "What would that look like, Zeke?" He took a slow breath. "You'd have your own room, Celas too. You'd run the house if you wanted or not. I'd see to everything else." Her arms folded loosely, not defensive, just thoughtful. "And what would you be in that arrangement?" "I'd be here," he said. "Same as I am now, but not alone anymore." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she crossed to the cupboard and took down a tin of dried apples, setting them on the counter without opening it. "I've never stayed anywhere longer than a season since Silas was born," she said. "Never had the chance to think about what comes after spring. You got the chance now." She looked toward the window where the sun had fallen low over the ridgeline. "He needs steadiness. And I need to know that if I put down roots, they won't be pulled up by someone else's choice." Zeke stepped closer, his voice low. "No one's pulling anything up, not if it's yours." Ellery turned back to him. "I don't know what to make of you." "You don't have to yet," he said. "Just know I mean what I say." She nodded just once, then picked up the tin and handed it to him. "You want pie? Peel those." That night, the scent of baked apples filled the house, and Silas fell asleep with his head tucked against his mother's side, thumb no longer in his mouth but curled under his chin. Zeke sat by the fire, boots off, watching the flames. Ellery came in from the back room with a folded blanket. "You always this quiet?" "Only when I'm thinking." "What about?" He glanced over at her. "How it's been a long time since this place felt like more than shelter." She laid the blanket over the back of the chair. "What's it feel like now?" Zeke looked toward the kitchen, where the pie sat cooling on the windowsill, and then toward the room where Celas slept. "Feels like it could be home." Ellery didn't speak, didn't move, but something in her face shifted. Not softened entirely, but eased, like a weight she hadn't noticed had finally been set down. She crossed to the fire and sat across from him. "I grew up in a house smaller than your barn. My father was a blacksmith. He died when I was 16. After that, it was just me. No one ever asked me to stay anywhere." He leaned his elbows on his knees. "You think you could get used to it?" "I think I could learn how." They sat there a while, the fire crackling between them, the night pressing soft against the windows. There was no declaration, no reaching across the space, just the warmth of two people no longer standing on opposite sides of a closed door. Tomorrow would come with chores and wood smoke and the first skim of frost on the trough. But tonight, there was quiet understanding. And the first shape of something lasting, just beginning to take root. The first snow came early, dusting the ridge line with white and settling into the cracks between the stones along the creek. Zeke could feel it in his knees before it showed itself deep and aching, a quiet warning. He spent the morning splitting logs by the barn, the sound of the axe echoing down the hollow, and the late sun casting long shadows by the time he stacked the last piece. Inside the house, the light glowed soft from oil lamps, and the smell of dried thyme clung faintly to the walls. Ellery was at the table, bent over a ledger with a stub of pencil in her hand and her brow drawn tight. "Didn't know we kept books," he said, kicking snow from his boots at the threshold. "I started one," she replied without lifting her head. "You've got supplies nearing empty." I wouldn't trust the flower past next week. He stepped closer, noting the neat columns she'd drawn. You always write that small. It's habit. Paper runs out faster than ink. Zeke reached for the kettle and poured hot water into a chipped mug. You planning to send for more from town? If the roads stay clear by next week, yes, I'll go. He lowered himself into the chair across from her. You shouldn't go alone. I've done it before. You don't have to now. Ellery tapped the end of the pencil against the page. I know. Celas let out a half-laugh from the back room, where he was playing with a length of wool string Zeke had given him earlier. The boy's voice was still high with youth, but he'd begun to mimic sounds from the animal's short whistles, little nickers, and he had the uncanny knack of doing it at the right moments. Zeke sipped the hot water and leaned back. He's clever. She nodded, folding the ledger shut. He's a watcher. Learns more by listening than being told. You were like that. I was quiet, she said. My mother used to say I kept a whole world in my head and only let out pieces when I was ready. You miss her. I miss what she might have said now, Ellery replied. I remember her hands more than her words. Zeke didn't press. Instead, he reached for the stack of mail he'd brought in earlier, 2 letters and a folded notice from Fort Benton. He slid the notice toward her. They're looking for someone to tend the infirmary, he said. Temporary posting. Just through spring. Ellery glanced down but didn't touch it. That's not for me. I thought you used to work with herbs. I did, but that wasn't in a place like that. Zeke waited, but she didn't elaborate. He folded the paper and set it aside. The silence that followed wasn't strained, just full of things too fresh to push. As he stood to fetch more wood for the hearth, she rose too, gathering the ledger and tucking it under her arm. I'll make a list for town, she said. We'll need salt pork and barley. And cloth if you plan to outgrow your shirts again. He grinned as he opened the door. Wasn't planning on it, but I'll keep it in mind. The wind slipped in, cold and dry. Zeke stepped into it, pulling his collar high. He crossed the yard toward the barn, where the horses shifted in their stalls, and the snow had begun to settle in soft drifts against the west wall. Inside, he ran his hand across the flank of the old bay mare, then reached for the halter hanging on the peg. He checked the tack, adjusted the girth on the saddle he'd planned to oil weeks ago, and listened to the creak of leather and the low breath of the animals. The barn was warm from their bodies, and the air smelled of hay and old wood. He thought of Ellery's hands on paper, her eyes scanning the lines of a ledger she hadn't been asked to keep. He thought about the way she didn't ask permission, just did what needed doing, and how she hadn't once asked for more than what she'd earned. He leaned his head against the mare's shoulder and closed his eyes a moment. Then, wordless, he returned to the house. Ellery had already banked the fire and was folding a towel near the stove. She looked up as he stepped back in, snow melting on his shoulders. I'll ride into town, he said. Day after tomorrow, you make the list, I'll get what we need. She didn't argue, just nodded once and held out the towel. He took it, brushed the moisture from his sleeves. I'll need to know what size boots Celas wears, he added. Ellery blinked. You already gave him yours to clomp around in. He'll grow out of those in a week. I'll get him real ones. Something flickered in her gaze, not surprise exactly, but recognition. She crossed the room, knelt beside the hearth, and opened the wooden box where she kept odds and ends. Pulling out a piece of string, she measured her son's foot against it in silence. She handed Zeke the string. He curled it into his palm and said nothing more. That night, after the lamps were lowered and the wind picked up against the shutters, Ellery stood by the window a long time. Zeke saw her there, silhouetted by moonlight, her hand resting lightly on the sill. He didn't speak, just watched the stillness of her, the way she seemed to be listening to something far off but steady, and for the first time in years he felt it too. Not silence, promise. The snow held off long enough for Zeke to make the ride to town and back before the river froze. He returned just after dusk, his coat lined with road dust and his saddle creaking under the weight of supplies. Ellery met him at the barn, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill, a lantern swinging gently from her hand. How was the road? she asked, her breath clouding in the air. Hard-packed but passable, he said, unloading a sack of barley from behind the saddle. A wagon wouldn't make it far, but the horse kept true. She reached for the sack, but he shook his head and carried it himself to the porch. Inside, the warmth of the stove took the edge off the cold, and Celas looked up from the braided rug where he sat carving a piece of soap into a shape that might have been a horse or a dog or both. Zeke crouched beside him and handed him a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Got you something." The boy peeled it open and held up a pair of new boots, the leather stiff and dark, the soles thick. He ran his fingers over the stitching, wide-eyed. Ellery watched from the hearth, saying nothing. "There's more," Zeke added, standing and walking to the saddlebag he'd left by the door. "Traded for some wool. Cuts long enough for a new coat. Thought you might want to make it yourself." She took the folded brown cloth, ran her hand over it slowly. "This is good wool. I figured you'd know what to do with it." "I do," she said, then, quieter, "Thank you." He nodded and turned back to the fire, unwrapping his scarf. Towns thinned out since summer. Some families moved closer to the fort for winter. The general store's shelves were lighter than I remember. You get everything? Close enough. The salt pork's lean, flour's decent. Got you coffee that doesn't taste like it's been hauled through 6 counties. He glanced over. There's a tin of peppermint, too. For him, Ellery's eyes softened, but she didn't let it linger. Instead, she turned toward the kitchen shelf, her voice even. "I've been thinking about spring." Zeke waited. "I'd like to start a garden," she continued. "Just herbs, maybe onions. If you've got seed potatoes, I can sprout them." "There's a patch behind the smokehouse," he said. "Good light, soil's tough, but it'll turn. I'll manage." He crossed the room and leaned against the doorframe. "You planning to stay that long?" She met his gaze. "I was hoping to." Zeke didn't speak for a beat. "Then I'd like that." Silas had come to stand between them now, one small hand on each of their knees. He looked up at Zeke. "Can I ride next time?" "Not yet," Ellery said gently, but Zeke smiled. "Not yet," he echoed. "But soon." The next weeks settled into a rhythm that felt less like habit and more like intention. Zeke repaired the south fence and hung new hinges on the barn door. Ellery stitched the wool into a coat that fit him like it had always belonged to his shoulders. She embroidered his initials inside the collar when she thought he wouldn't notice. Celas followed them both with quiet trust, his boots breaking in with every step. One night in early December, when the wind rattled the eaves and the fire threw long shadows against the floorboards, Zeke found Ellery standing by the window. "You watching the snow?" he asked. She turned to him. "I'm watching the quiet." He stepped close enough to see the fine lines near her eyes, the way her hands stilled once she'd settled them against her waist. "You afraid of it?" "No," she said. "Not anymore." He reached for her hand, careful, and she didn't pull away. "I've been thinking, too," he said, "about what it'd mean if you stayed for good." She looked up at him, face open and still. "You wouldn't be the cook," he said. "You'd be my wife." Ellery's fingers tightened around his. "That what you're asking?" "It is." She didn't answer right away, but he saw it in her the way stillness gave way to something steadier. She looked toward the back room where Silas slept, then back at him. "I'll say yes," she said. "If you mean it." "I've never meant anything more." They married the following week, quiet and simple. The preacher from town came out ahead of the storm, his wool scarf frozen at the ends. They stood beneath the bare cottonwoods behind the barn, Celas holding onto Ellery's skirt, and said their vows with the breath of horses rising behind them. The men from the bunkhouse carved a table from old pine and gifted it with a tin of honey and a loaf of winter bread. No one made speeches. No one needed to. That night, after the boy fell asleep with a quilt tucked to his chin, Zeke and Ellery sat by the fire, hands entwined. "You scared?" he asked. "No," she said. "Not with you." The wind howled against the windows, but the house held fast. So did they. Years passed. The garden behind the smokehouse grew wild with thyme and onions and the soft leaves of potatoes. Celas outgrew his boots and learned to ride before his 7th year. Ellery taught him numbers and quiet pride. Zeke taught him fence posts and how to look a man in the eye. The ranch never boomed, but it never broke either. They built a second room and planted cottonwoods along the path to the barn. Elders from town came for Ellery's teas and her winter tonics. Zeke never once had to sleep alone again. On cold nights, when the wind pulled hard from the mountains, they sat by the hearth, her head resting against his shoulder, his hand warm at the small of her back. They didn't need many words. They'd found something better. They lived like the land, quiet, strong, and wholly theirs. And they were happy every single day.